The medals made a soft, terrible sound when they hit the glass counter, a sound Simone Farrell had never imagined she would hear. She'd set them down carefully, one by one, the way a person does when they're trying not to let their hands shake in public. The mention in dispatches, the Medal of Military Valor, the Canadian Forces decoration. Each one had a ribbon she could still name the colors of without looking. Red, gold, crimson. She'd ironed those ribbons more times than she could count. In barracks that smelled of diesel and antiseptic, in forward operating bases where the water rations ran short. She'd worn them to ceremonies and to funerals, and to the one occasion, 2 years ago, when her commanding officer had shaken her hand in front of a formation and said, without irony, that she'd done something that mattered. Now a man named Ernie Sabo was peering at them through smudged reading glasses, turning the Medal of Military Valor over in his fingers like he was appraising a piece of vintage jewelry. In a sense, she supposed, he was. I can do 250, Ernie said. Maybe 280 if you leave the case. Simone said nothing. She was doing the arithmetic in her head, the kind that had become the background noise of her life these past 11 weeks. Rent was $1,340. She had $219 in her account. She hadn't been paid in 73 days. Veterans Affairs Canada had sent her 3 letters in a row, each one requesting a different form that contradicted the form requested in the letter before it. And her nursing license, the one thing she'd fought to keep, the one thing that had nothing to do with the armed forces and everything to do with who she actually was currently suspended pending a hospital review that had no completion date. She needed $2,500 to keep the lights on, and the storage locker paid for another month. She needed 3 times that to even begin to think about legal representation. 280 wasn't going to do it. She put her palms flat on the glass and leaned in slightly. These aren't costume pieces, she said. The MMV is documented. I can provide the citation. Ernie looked up from the medal. He had the particular expression of a man who'd seen people in desperate situations every day for 20 years and had learned not to let it affect him professionally. I know what it is, he said, but I sell to collectors, and collectors in Kingston want coins and watches. I can't move military honors for what they're worth to you. Worth to you. The phrase landed somewhere in her sternum and stayed there. She was about to tell him fine, 280, whatever, when the bell above the door chimed. The dog came in first. It was a Belgian Malinois, lean and amber-colored, wearing a tactical vest with a small Canadian flag patch on the left shoulder. It moved the way working dogs move when they're on a leash, but not really on a leash, controlled, precise, tracking everything. Behind it came a man in a Canadian Armed Forces duty uniform, a master corporal's rank on his sleeve, about 35, with a jaw like a door hinge and eyes that had the quick focus quality of someone who'd spent years in environments where missing something had consequences. The dog, his name, according to the tag on his vest, was Atlas, came directly to the counter, not toward the door, not toward the display cases along the far wall. To the counter where Simone was standing, he sat down beside her very close and put his chin on the glass surface next to the medals. And he didn't move. Atlas, the master corporal's voice was low and even, here. Atlas didn't move. The master corporal walked up to the counter. He looked at his dog, then he looked down at the medals. His face changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the kind that happens to people when they recognize something that shouldn't be where it is. A rearranging of the features, a stillness that comes before speech. He looked at the Medal of Military Valor for a long moment. Then he looked at Simone. You served, he said. It wasn't a question. 8 years, she said. Nursing officer. Deployed twice. She stopped. She hadn't explained herself to anyone in 11 weeks, and she'd gotten quite good at not doing it. She wasn't sure why she was doing it now, to a stranger whose dog had just sat down uninvited next to her military decorations. Joel Krawchuk, the master corporal said. He didn't extend his hand, but he didn't look away either. K9 Unit, CSFB Kingston, what are you doing here? The question was direct enough that it almost made her laugh. The same thing everyone does here, she said. I'm trying to solve a problem that shouldn't exist. Ernie Sabo had retreated a diplomatic 6 inches down the counter. Atlas had not moved. His chin was still resting on the glass an inch from the metals, and his eyes were moving between Simone and Joel with a calm attention that felt. She knew this was absurd, almost deliberate. She told Krawchuk the short version because she'd learned that the long version made people's eyes go slightly glazed. The whistleblower complaint she'd filed against the administrator of the hospital unit, where she'd worked after leaving the forces. The suspension that followed within 4 days. The hospital's internal review that had been running for 3 months with no output. And the separate complication with her military discharge paperwork, which had been somehow flagged as administrative irregularity, a classification that froze her Veterans Affairs file and had no clear appeal pathway that anyone at VAC had been able to explain to her. The administrator's name is Pratchett, she said, Lorne Pratchett. He's been falsifying patient transfer documentation to qualify for federal care coordination funding. I have records. I kept copies. She paused. He has, I believe, a reasonably good relationship with at least one person on the hospital board who has a reasonably good relationship with people in Ottawa, which is why the review has no completion date. Krawchuk was quiet for a moment. Atlas's tail moved once, then stopped. Where are the copies? Krawchuk asked. Storage locker. Frontenac Storage on Princess Street. She hesitated, then said it plainly, because there was no dignified way to soften it. I've been sleeping in my car in my cousin's parking lot for the past week. I can't access the locker without the monthly payment. I can't make the payment without money. I can't get money without my license. I can't get my license back until the review completes. And the review won't complete without Pratchett's cooperation. She looked down at the medals. So. Ernie Sabo cleared his throat. Atlas lifted his chin from the glass, looked at Ernie for approximately 1 second, and put it back down. It was Krawchuk who finally broke the silence. Pick those up, he said, nodding at the medals. You're not selling them today. Master Corporal, with respect, I need. I know what you need, he said, and I'm not saying you'll get all of it. But you're not selling those today. Something in his voice shifted, not commanding exactly, but certain in a way she hadn't heard from anyone in almost 3 months. Atlas doesn't do this. In 6 years, he has never once. He looked down at the dog, who still hadn't moved. He knows something I should probably listen to. She put the medals back in their case. She wasn't sure why. She'd walked into that shop with a plan, and the plan had made financial sense. And this was a stranger's dog refusing to leave, and a master corporal she'd met 4 minutes ago talking about listening to his animal. None of it was rational. But she picked up the case, and she clipped it shut, and she felt something in her chest loosen by about 3 degrees. That night, Simone slept in her car in her cousin Priya's parking lot in Cataraqui, listening to the October wind move through the maples. Krawchuk had given her his card. He'd said he knew people at the CFNIS, the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service, who might be interested in the documentation angle separately from the hospital complaint. He'd said he couldn't promise anything, and he said it plainly enough that she believed him. He said he'd make some calls. She'd said thank you and meant it, which was harder than it sounded because thank you at that point in her life felt like swallowing glass. She was at the storage locker by 8 in the morning. She transferred money from a credit card she'd been trying not to touch, 3 months of fees, $127, and retrieved the 2 folders she'd been keeping at the back of a filing box labeled Nursing Textbooks, 41 pages. Patient transfer records, funding claim submissions, internal communications she'd been copied on before the suspension made her invisible. She photographed each page separately and emailed the files to 2 different addresses, her personal account and a new one she'd created on her phone the night before. The gray Honda Civic she'd noticed the previous 2 mornings, parked half a block from Priya's building, was there again when she pulled out. She didn't know if it meant anything. She told herself she didn't know if it meant anything. Krawchuk called at 11. I spoke to someone, he said. There's interest, but I need to ask you something. Is there anyone still inside the system? The hospital, the military side, anywhere? Who knew what you knew before you filed? She thought about it. There was one name she'd been turning over in her mind for weeks without letting herself fully think it. Brigadier General Patricia Sundaram, who had been Simone's brigade medical officer's direct superior during the second deployment, who had signed off on Simone's citation for the MMV, and who was, she'd seen this in a Forces news release 6 weeks ago, retiring at the end of November. Possibly, Simone said, but she's senior enough that approaching her directly would be. Let me, Krawchuk said. I know someone who knows someone. That's how it works, unfortunately. A pause. Shouldn't be how it works, but it is. The next 3 weeks were the kind that teach you the difference between patience and passivity. Simone filed the formal complaint with the Ontario College of Nurses again. Third attempt, this time with a letter from a legal advocate named Breckenridge that Krawchuk had connected her with, a woman who worked pro bono for healthcare whistleblowers 2 days a week and was terrifyingly good at it. She filed a separate complaint with Veterans Affairs, attaching documentation that Breckenridge had helped her organize. She answered questions from a CFNIS investigator named Haverstock via encrypted email about the irregularity in her discharge paperwork. She did not sell her medals. She slept in her car for 11 more nights, then in Priya's spare room when Priya's partner, a soft-spoken man named Rajesh, said quietly that the couch was actually a pullout and always had been. The gray Honda Civic stopped appearing on November 4th. She didn't know why, and she didn't ask. On the 9th of November, 2 days before Remembrance Day, Brigadier General Sundaram gave a statement, not public, not yet, but filed with the appropriate bodies, confirming that the administrative irregularity in Simone Farrell's discharge file was not of Simone's making. It had originated in a clerical process that had since been flagged in 2 other cases, and the timing of the irregularity relative to Simone's internal hospital complaint warranted further examination. The Brigadier General was very precise in her language. She used phrases like pattern of concern and domiciliation inconsistency and warrants review at the ministerial level. What she meant, in the language people use before they use official language, was someone had touched that file, and it hadn't been Simone, and the timing was not a coincidence. Lorne Pratchett resigned from the hospital on November 19th. The resignation was announced as a personal decision in a 2-sentence internal memo. By then, the Ontario Health Ministry had opened a formal audit of the hospital's federal care coordination funding claims going back 4 years. By then, Simone's nursing license suspension had been lifted, conditionally, pending final review, but lifted. By then, her Veterans Affairs file had been unflagged, and a case manager had actually called her on the phone, a human being, and apologized for the delay in a way that sounded like it came from a script, but was nonetheless the first apology anyone from any institution had offered her in 4 months. She was in a Tim Hortons on Bath Road when the call came through confirming the license. Medium coffee, double-double, the way she'd drunk it since she was a student at Queen's and couldn't afford anything fancier. She sat with her hands wrapped around the cup for a long time after she hung up. The person at the next table was reading a newspaper. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone's child was building a tower out of stir sticks near the window. She didn't cry. She'd thought she might, but she didn't. She just sat there, very still, the way Atlas had sat beside her at that counter. Not going anywhere, not giving in, holding the space until something shifted. Krawchuk met her at the storage locker a week later to return the copies she'd given the investigator. Atlas came along. The dog walked straight to Simone, pressed his head against her leg, and stood there for a moment before Krawchuk made a sound, and he fell back into professional composure. He doesn't do that either, Krawchuk said. He was almost smiling. He seems to do a lot of things he doesn't do, Simone said. The back pay from the military, 46 days of pay she was owed for the period affected by the administrative irregularity, plus the retroactive adjustments to her Veterans Affairs file, came through on December 3rd. It wasn't a large sum in the context of what the preceding months had cost her, financially and otherwise, but it covered 3 months of rent and the credit card she'd stopped looking at and Breckenridge's filing fees, which Breckenridge had insisted on waiving, but Simone insisted on paying. She sent Krawchuk a message the day the transfer cleared. Just thank you, both of you. He wrote back an hour later. Atlas says you're welcome. I was going to let him have the credit, but that seemed dishonest. She started back at Kingston General in January on a different unit under a charge nurse named Prentice, who had a reputation for running a tight ward and not suffering administrators lightly. On her first shift, a patient, an older man, a veteran, who'd come in overnight with a chest infection, saw the MMV ribbon she still kept pinned to the small corkboard above her locker and said, without preamble, "That's a hell of a thing to have." "Yes," she said, "it is." She meant it differently than she once had. The medal had always meant the moment it was awarded for. A night in a field station, a decision made under pressure, people who came home partly because someone had stayed at their side. But now it meant something else too, something she hadn't had a word for until that morning in the pawn shop when a dog she'd never met had put his chin on the glass next to it and refused to move. The hospital board released a formal statement in February acknowledging failures in the internal review process and committing to changes in the whistleblower protocol. There was no mention of Simone Farrell by name. There was no public apology. She hadn't expected one. What she hadn't expected, what she was still, some mornings, surprised by, was Brigadier General Sundaram's retirement speech, delivered at CFB Kingston in late November, which had included, buried in the middle of a paragraph about institutional accountability, a single sentence: "We do not honor our people by protecting the system that failed them. We honor them by fixing it." It wasn't directed at Simone. It wasn't about her specifically. But Simone had read the transcript 3 times, alone in Priya's spare room, before she set her phone down and looked at the ceiling for a long while. The system hadn't fixed itself. It had needed pushing and pushing again, and a K-9 with an instinct nobody could fully explain, and a brigadier general deciding that her last act in uniform would be the one that told the truth. It had needed Breckenridge, who billed no one. It had needed Haverstock, who asked the right questions in the right order. It had needed Priya and Rajesh and a pull-out couch that had always been there. It had needed, at the very beginning, a dog who walked into a pawn shop and sat down next to a woman he'd never met and didn't leave. Simone Farrell kept her medals. She kept them in the same case, in the same spot on the shelf above her locker at Kingston General, where she could see them at the start of every shift. Not as a reminder of what she'd almost lost, but as proof that some things, if you hold on long enough, refuse to be taken from you.